I never thought a simple text message could destroy my world, but that's exactly how it started. The notification tone echoed in the dark, a soft ping that shattered everything I believed in. I wasn't even looking for secrets, I just wanted to check the time. But when my phone lit up, it wasn't the time that caught my eye. It was a photo. Her. Him. My bed. I remember the way my chest tightened as the image burned into my mind. The bedsheet, the curve of his shoulder, the reflection of my own lamp in the background, it all screamed one thing: betrayal. And the worst part? The photo came from a number I didn't recognize, with a message that simply read: "You should know who he's loving when he says he's working late." For a second, I couldn't breathe. The room around me disappeared. My body felt too small for the pain that hit me. But as I stared at that screen, something inside me began to shift. The numbness turned to heat. And from that heat, a single thought formed. Don't cry. Plan. That's how it began. Not with tears, but with fire. The next morning, I didn't say a word. I made his coffee like I always did. I even smiled when he walked into the kitchen, wearing the same shirt he'd worn in the photo. My fingers trembled as I poured the coffee, but my smile didn't. I had to keep it together, because if he saw even a flicker of what I knew, he'd take everything, my sanity, my reputation, my life as I knew it, and crush it beneath his lies. He leaned in, brushed his lips against my cheek, and said, "I'll be late tonight." Big project. I almost laughed. Project, right. I wanted to ask how long she'd been part of his project plan, but I bit my tongue. Instead, I said, "Of course. I'll see you later." I watched him leave. The sound of his car fading down the street was the sound of my old self dying. The next step was obvious: I needed to know who. The number that sent the photo was blocked, but I was done being passive. I'd been the quiet one for too long, the one who trusted, who believed, who excused every late night and every sudden business trip. Not anymore. So I followed him. The first night, nothing. He actually went to work. The second night, the same. But on the third night, as the sun disappeared, his routine changed. He didn't turn toward the office. Instead, he drove to the other side of town, somewhere I'd never been, a part of the city that only existed in stories of neon and secrets. I parked a few cars behind and watched as he pulled into a hotel parking lot. He didn't even hesitate. The way he moved, the way he looked around, it was practiced. This wasn't the first time. This was routine. And then she came out. She wasn't what I expected. Younger, maybe. Or maybe it was just the way she looked at him, like she already had what I was too stupid to see. She touched his arm, smiled up at him, and they disappeared inside together. I sat in my car until my hands stopped shaking. Then I drove home. Not because I was done, but because I needed to think. I needed to understand what had just happened, and what needed to happen next. That night, I didn't sleep. I spent hours scrolling through his messages, his photos, his calendar. Everything. And the deeper I dug, the more I found. It wasn't just her. There were others. Messages, receipts, hotel reservations under fake names. He wasn't just cheating, he was living a double life. That's when I decided to become someone new too. If he could lie, then so could I. If he could play, then so could I. But unlike him, I wouldn't make mistakes. The first thing I needed was proof, undeniable, unerasable evidence. And once I had that, I'd make him feel what I felt. Because I wasn't going to confront him with tears, I was going to destroy him with silence. A week later, I booked the same hotel. I needed to know what kind of place my humiliation had been dragged into. When I walked through the lobby, I felt my heart pounding, but I didn't hesitate. I wasn't there as the woman he betrayed, I was there as the woman who would soon betray him. The receptionist smiled, completely unaware that she was part of my plan. "Welcome back," she said, glancing at the reservation. I smiled back, realizing my name wasn't on it, but his was. He had used his name. That made it even better. I checked in. The room was clean, sterile, but as I looked around, I could feel the ghosts of his lies lingering in the air. The mirror by the bed. The shape of the sheets. Everything felt like a copy of a moment that had once destroyed me. But as I sat on that bed, the humiliation turned into something else: power. Because in that moment, I realized something: I didn't just want to catch him. I wanted to make him wish he'd never done it. I wanted to turn his own secret world into a trap. So I started building it. The first part of revenge, I learned, is patience. The second part is invention. I spent the first days after the hotel in a fog of preparation. I was careful, not because I feared getting caught, but because I wanted every move to be clean, surgical. I wanted the evidence I collected to be indisputable, unassailable. I wanted his life to collapse under the weight of facts, not under the shaky testimony of tears. Facts couldn't be argued away. Facts could be amplified, shared, archived. So I made a list. Photographs. Receipts. A timeline. Witnesses, if possible. Security footage, if accessible. Anything that connected his face, his voice, his name to the places and the acts he swore were work emergencies. I wrote it all down in a notebook, numbering each item and giving it a color code like a surgeon preparing instruments. When the plan was assembled, the notebook lived in the bottom drawer of my bedside table, folded into the darkness like a promise. My first step was the easiest. I signed up for the hotel loyalty program under a slight variation of my name. It was petty, but I needed a foothold. The hotel system showed check-ins by name, date, card used. When I compared dates with the calendar invitations and the strange weekend absences, a pattern emerged. His name was there more than once. Not anonymized. Not under an alias. He had used a corporate card tied to his office for some stays, and that opened a different door, one that would widen when I pulled on the thread. I dug into receipts. I learned to read between lines: a meal charged at an odd hour, spa services labeled vaguely, parking fees from other zip codes. Each entry told a story if you listened. I started to map his life the way I used to map my grocery lists, with obsessive detail and satisfaction. But the receipts alone wouldn't topple him. People lose receipts. They tap expense and move on. I needed something more humiliating, something public. That required exposure. But reckless exposure is a blunt instrument. I wanted precision. So I began micromanaging the narrative before it was even written. I rebuilt my own digital life as a stage set. I posted things I wouldn't normally post: photos of mundane outings, small victories, late-night study sessions on my laptop, each carefully constructed to present me as composed, calm, unbothered. It was a misdirection, the way magicians draw eyes to one hand while the real trick is happening in the other. Then I found someone useful. There's always someone useful in these stories, someone who will do the thing you need because they want something in return. For me, it was a woman who worked 2 floors beneath his office in a department I barely knew existed. I'd seen her in passing, always with a red pen, eyebrows knit, the sort of person who makes the corporate world hum with quiet efficiency. I called and left a message asking to meet about a company expense irregularity. I didn't tell her the truth. The truth is combustible. I told her only what would get her attention. I mentioned the corporate card and a weekend stay she might not be aware of. She responded within a day. We met for coffee in a neutral place, an austere cafe where waiters wore halos of professionalism and didn't ask questions. I watched her look at me the way people look at new cases, curious, slightly predatory. Her name was not mine to use, her life was not mine to narrate. I only needed cooperation. She was meticulous. She told me what internal auditing looked like, how expense reports could be flagged, and what evidence the compliance team would need to open an investigation. Her eyes shone with the thrill of bureaucracy, like a hobbyist discovering a secret garden. She agreed to look into the corporate card reports if I could provide dates and merchant names. I gave her everything I had. In return, I gave her something trivial but effective, a story that painted her as the hero who uncovered a systemic issue. People love to be heroes. While she worked inside, I worked outside. I began to engineer chance. I learned the places he frequented: the office coffee shop with the artisanal beans, the late-night jazz bar where he liked to drink away the guilt, the stadium parking lot where he met someone in the rain. I timed my movements to cross paths with him at moments that would expose him without making me look like an obvious investigator. Once, purely by coincidence, I insisted to myself, I left the gym 10 minutes before he did and walked past his car as he was fumbling with his keys. I smiled in a way I hadn't smiled in months, letting the air around me thicken with normalcy. He kept his eyes forward and pretended not to see me. For the first time since the photo, I felt the delicious taste of power, of being known to him and silent about it. But I wanted more than power. I wanted rupture. So I built a second, darker layer to my plan. There are small economies within a marriage that people never notice until they collapse. I began to empty his bank of the illusions that supported him. Not by theft, never that, but by exposing what people rely on. I reached out to the bar where he sometimes handed out business cards to women at the bar. I asked the manager about the night of a certain date and, over the course of a few carefully staged conversations, obtained a grainy CCTV clip. It showed a man who looked like him, laughing and leaning too close to a woman whose face was blurred. It was not definitive, but it would be a piece. I wasn't above theatrics. Revenge, I found, enjoys theater. I seduced his friends without seducing them at all. I volunteered to host a small dinner for a bunch of people who orbited his life, colleagues, a neighbor, the woman who ran the school bake sale committee. I cooked the food, arranged the wine, and set the table as if nothing in the world were wrong. I made sure the playlist was perfect and that the living room smelled of citrus and thyme. I made small talk, laughed at the right moments, let them talk about him. It was during one of those evenings that I learned how easily people construct the world they want to keep. They answered his calls even when he was late. They made excuses for his absences. They projected onto him the virtues they wanted. They were not bad people, they were collaborators in a lie because denial is comfortable. I let them talk. I let them speak his praises. Then, in a soft voice over coffee, I casually mentioned I'd found a hotel confirmation under his name and that the company card had popped up for weekend expenses. I watched their faces rearrange inside their skulls like furniture in a sudden room. Some narrowed their eyes, some laughed uneasily, the neighbor's face went pale. Nobody accused me. Nobody needed to. The idea hung there like the taste of metal. By then, my inside contact had done her part. She'd quietly escalated the corporate expense items to compliance with an internal note. They opened a file. A week later, I had an email from her, a curt line saying, "We've initiated a review." I wanted to cheer, but instead, I folded my hands and measured my breath. Bureaucracy is slow, but when it moves through other people's hands, a necessary diffusion of responsibility that makes the impact feel less like me and more like inevitability. If the corporate review would ruin his job, then I needed something to ruin what he loved to showcase, his public image. He was a man who polished his image like a trophy, speeches, volunteer events, the community awards he insisted on attending. He built a persona of someone who cared. I intended to dismantle it. So I began feeding a narrative into the places that mattered, anonymized tips to a lifestyle blog that loved scandal, a careful comment on a community board about suspicious late-night activity, a message to the editor of the paper that covered the charity events he paraded through. I didn't write inflammatory accusations, I fed facts and questions. I asked if anyone had ever noticed odd billing on corporate cards. I asked if the community had a mechanism to vet those who volunteered. The questions were small seeds, I let the wind carry them. At the same time, I courted the one person who might shatter him immediately if convinced, his lover, if she truly was. I did not want to intimidate her, I wanted to offer her a mirror. My first contact was careful. A comment on an Instagram photo, casual and unthreatening, "Loved your review of the cafe near the theater." She responded with a smile emoji and a flurry of direct messages about pastries. Our messages were innocuous at first, but I steered them with a deftness that would have made a sailor proud. I let her reveal the small things, the way she loved Madrid tiles, the fact that she preferred cappuccino to espresso. Her tone was youthful, bright, uncomplicated. I found the contrast between her and me intoxicating. I wanted to make her complicit. I slid into the conversation with the coolness of someone who was also a consumer. "I've been trying to find the best cappuccino in the city," I wrote. "Your recommendations are great. Do you ever go to Name of the Jazz Bar?" She admitted she did. She mentioned his name flippantly. That was the crack I needed. If she was with him, she would reveal patterns. She did. We met for coffee once, under the pretense of swapping recommendations about pastry shops. She arrived late, hair in a messy bun, eyes wide. She smiled the smile of someone who had not yet been hurt. I watched her as we talked in a warm cafe that smelled of roasted beans and citrus. I listened to how she spoke of the weekends, the flirty texts, the stolen mornings. She did not know what I knew. I didn't tell her. Instead, I let bits of evidence fall naturally into the conversation, a screenshot accidentally shown, a shared joke about the jazz bar. I watched her face as she made little connections. She was naive, and the world we lived in required a certain cruelty. I had to decide how much to reveal and how much to hide. I chose to reveal enough to make her quiet. I told her, gently, that she deserved better. She laughed, a brittle sound, and said, "He says he wants something serious." I tasted bile. She believed him. I did not tell her I had the photos. I did not tell her he'd used the company card. I did not tell her I had a plan that would ripple through their lives. But I wanted her to know my existence as someone who watched, who could move things if necessary. The knowledge alone, of being observed, can make someone careful, and carelessness had always been his downfall. One evening, after another long day of small manipulations, I sat in my car and opened the folder of images I'd collected. Each picture was a small incision into his private anatomy. I looked at the grainy CCTV clip, the hotel confirmation, the charge for a spa on a Sunday afternoon, the flirty messages that read like petals. I arranged them on the screen the way a designer creates a mood board, textures of betrayal, tones of embarrassment, a palette of lies. My finger hovered over the share button more than once, each time pulled back by the legal sense that told me to be careful. Revenge that is too loud can be deflected, revenge that is steady, relentless, and reasonable is fatal. So I held back. I continued to assemble. And then something unexpected happened, a moment that almost broke the architecture I was building. He came home early. He walked through the door with a bouquet that was meant to look like remorse, peonies, slightly bruised, arranged as if at a florist's last-minute scramble. He hugged me and said, "I'm sorry. I should have told you. I was stupid." His voice was honeyed and quick. He used the word stupid like a charm, a small ladder he thought would carry him back into trust. I watched him watch my face searching for signs of unraveling. I could have screamed. I could have shown him the phone and demanded truth until the plaster fell from the walls. But I had rehearsed restraint like prayer. I smiled and accepted the flowers. "Thank you," I said. The words tasted like sulfur. He put the bouquet on the table and kissed my forehead. He did not know that the flowers smelled of humiliation. He left to go to the office again, except this time, I knew better. I had planted the seed in his world, and the seed was germinating. There would be more than one way for the truth to come out now. The corporate review would continue its slow, grinding process. The community whispers I'd ignited would find ears. The woman in the cafe, if pushed, might become a witness who could carve the affair into a thesis. Each piece continued to move, each person I'd touched was now part of the mechanism. That night, alone with the bouquet, I found myself at a window watching the city breathe. The lights winked like a million small judgments. For a moment, loneliness swelled, not the hollow emptiness that had visited the day I saw the photo, but a keen, precise loneliness like a scalpel's edge. Revenge is not only about the other person. It is an education in your own thresholds. How far will you go? What are you willing to lose? I found the edges of my fear and pressed my thumb against them until they flattened. When his life began to fray, I felt the thrill, but there was also a coldness that surprised me. He was the man who had shared my bed, who had said we in quiet hours, who had made future plans that now seemed like props. I had loved him within the safety of a child's faith. Now, love was a currency I refused to spend. I could not afford softness. 2 weeks after the hotel revelation, the audit flagged 3 weekend transactions to a boutique hotel chain. Compliance asked for documentation. They requested him to explain the business purpose of the expenses. My contact forwarded me the email with the subject line, "Request for clarification, expense reports." I printed it and placed it in the stack of evidence like a germinal seed. The corporate team was procedural but ruthless. They moved quietly, like a winter wind that creaks branches and brings down weak fruit. He answered with plausible deniability, clients in from out of town, a conference he claimed to have attended. He provided names of people who, to my knowledge, did not exist. When compliance dug deeper, they found inconsistencies. One of the clients denied ever being at the hotel. The conference schedule didn't match the dates on the receipt. It was enough to keep the file open. And then the blog editor wrote back. "Is this something you can document?" she asked. "We don't print accusations without documentation. Send what you have." I sent it. Not everything. Not yet. But enough to make the editor curious, enough for them to talk among themselves. A small investigation, a paragraph, a whispering column, things that ripen into headlines. I was patient. I was meticulous. I was, for the first time in a long time, entirely and utterly in control. By the time he realized his life was being dismantled, the machinery was already humming. The first sound he heard wasn't the clatter of a falling life, it was the slow, silent creak of decisions, my decisions, being carried out like a well-oiled clock. He would think he had time to fix things. He would be wrong. There is a cruelty to watching someone realize the ground beneath them is shifting. It is a lesson in the energetic difference between those who take and those who are taken from. I had been taken from. Now, I would be the force that rearranged the world he had built. The next move, I knew, would require me to step out from behind the curtain I'd been hiding behind. It would require a confrontation that I could no longer avoid, not with him, but with the consequences of my own growing appetite for ruin. I had to decide whether my revenge would leave me whole or simply hollow out another part of me. But that decision was for later. For now, the trap was set. The bait was bloodless, receipts, timelines, small confessions tucked into polite emails, and yet it was lethal. He would not see it coming until it was too late. And when he did, the sound of him falling would be drowned out by the quiet satisfaction of someone who had finally learned how to break a life without being broken. When the first article appeared, it was a small thing, a paragraph tucked between the lifestyle column and the events roundup, the kind of placement that makes people skim rather than notice. But placement doesn't matter when the content is precise. The piece asked questions about inconsistent corporate expenses and the ethics of using company funds for off-site client entertainment. It mentioned a name. Not mine. Not his. Just the facts and a few pointed questions. The writer did not accuse, only nudged. He called me the second the headline hit his phone. I could hear panic in his voice, like someone trying to hold back a flood with their hands. "What did you do?" he demanded, breath sharp with fear. He sounded smaller than I'd ever heard him, and for a strange instant, something like pity flickered in me. It passed as quickly as it came. "I didn't do anything," I said, careful and soft. "People are asking questions." He swallowed. I could hear plates clinking somewhere behind him, the background noise of the life he still pretended was ordinary. "This is ridiculous," he said. "It's nothing. I'll fix it." "You'll have to," I said. I realized with a cold little thrill that his need to fix things no longer involved me. It involved saving himself. After that, things accelerated faster than I'd expected. Compliance called him in. The company placed him on leave pending an investigation. His scheduled speeches were cancelled by a terse email. The community event where he was supposed to receive recognition issued a statement postponing the awards. The world he'd curated, meetings, mentorship photos, volunteer gala shots, started to look like a performance, and performances invite critique. People began to ask questions in the spaces where they'd once offered him admiration. At dinner parties, conversations shifted to the controversy, and colleagues who had never failed to invite him began to speak in hypotheticals. The woman from the bake sale committee sent a message that said, simply, "I'm so sorry," as if I had been the victim of a random tragedy instead of the architect of one. Her pity felt stolen. The lover, if she wanted to be called that, sent me a message too. It was short and full of confusion. "Did you?" it asked. "Are you the one?" There was no threat in it, only bewilderment. I replied with the barest honesty I could muster without giving myself away, "Ask him." Then I blocked her, partly to keep the conversation from spiraling, partly because I was tired of seeing the human faces of my plans. They complicated the math. His friends shrank back. The ones who stayed reached out in careful, public ways, texts that said, "Thinking of you," and an awkward dinner invitation as if nothing could happen to a reputation built on half-truths. He answered with gratitude that felt like a dying man's clutch at air. He told them he was being harassed by an anonymous source. He called the whole thing a smear campaign. Denial is a practiced art. He performed it well. But denial couldn't erase documentation. Compliance had the receipts, the hotel confirmations, a witness statement that placed him in the area at a given time. The tiny, damning things I had collected were doing what they were meant to do. They were translating shame into institutional consequences. In the eyes of the company, facts mattered. In the eyes of the community, optics mattered. He was losing both. He called me less. When he did, his voice sounded bare. "Please," he said at one point, voice breaking. "Don't make this worse." The plea landed like a stone on water. My instinct was to throw it back, but I didn't. For a moment I felt the old tenderness, the one that knows how to forgive because forgiveness is a shelter. It surprised me how easily that current ran through me and how quickly I shut the tap. "I'm not making anything worse," I said. "You made your choices." The sentence was neat and final. He did not argue. He could not. Then, in a move that surprised even me, he tried to bargain. Men like him are adept at turning situations into transactions. He offered money, promises of therapy, staunch vows to stop. He offered public apologies scripted by PR professionals. He offered to step down quietly if the company would let him. The offers were all attempts to buy restoration. None of them bought back the trust he had squandered. To my astonishment, the part of me that wanted to see him repaid with equal suffering had to reconcile with the part that remembered. I remembered late nights when he would read aloud the silly parts of an article and laugh, his hand finding mine across the coffee table. I remembered the way he hummed in the shower like a child. I remembered the plans for small, ridiculous things, vacation spots, furniture stores, the kind of future that is boring and therefore safe. The memory made the revenge taste bittersweet. But what I desired more than revenge was restoration, for myself. Not restoration of the old complacent life, but a kind of reclamation, my time, my dignity, my reputation. The man who had built his life on choices that excluded me would be stripped down to the same truth, choice and consequence. I wanted him to witness accountability the way I had to witness betrayal. So I continued. I scheduled meetings with people who mattered. I contacted the small lifestyle press again and furnished them with a timeline and an anonymous tip that suggested the pattern was not an isolated incident. I sent the editor a copy of a charge that matched dates with a photograph I knew existed. I did not send the photograph, discretion is leverage. I let them ask for it. I let them know I had something they might want to see, and that something made them move. One of the journalists requested an interview. They were gentle, not out of compassion but because gentleness sells a narrative of fairness. When they asked me to speak on the record, I almost refused. Speaking would put me into the spiral I'd been trying to avoid, my voice public, vulnerable. But I realized something important, the narrative had always been told around me. This time I would tell a part of it. I agreed. I spoke carefully. I talked about the signs anyone could miss, inconsistent stories, the pattern of absences, the way small lies escalate into big systems. I didn't say his name. I didn't have to. The journalist could make the rest. They ran a piece that framed the issue as a broader look at workplace ethics and personal accountability, and while it remained cautious, the shade of scandal was now darker. The company moved faster after that. The legal team began to ask for documents. He hired a lawyer who called me twice, once politely, once with thinly veiled threats. The lawyer wanted to know what my endgame was. I told him the truth, accountability. He did not like my answer. She's dangerous, the lawyer said about me in one of our conversations, and it was the first time someone else had called me that and I felt proud instead of ashamed. The pressure on him increased. A meeting that had once been his to lead was replaced by whispers. He sat with me one night across a table I had set with too much care as if to prove something. He looked exhausted in a way triumph never makes people look. Please, he said, and he reached for my hand. I felt his fingers, familiar and thin. He tried to charm me with small apologies, a confession shaped into a commodity he thought I might buy for old memories. I pulled my hand away. Why? I asked quietly. I didn't want to know about the other woman's clothes or his excuses. I wanted to know what happened to the person who once promised to share a life. His answer was a litany of dissatisfactions and unmet expectations. He framed his infidelity as an escape. It was never about you, he said. It was about me. The sentence was a balm meant to soothe his conscience. I wanted to laugh at the audacity. I told him something I had rehearsed in the car 1,000 times and never spoken aloud. It was about your choices. You chose to hurt me. You chose secrecy. You chose to step outside. The words felt small, like settling an account. They did not unman him. They did not restore me. But they clarified where our moral debts lay. He left soon after, and for the first time in months, I slept without the tight coil of planned thoughts. Strange relief poured through me like warm water. The immediate storm had passed, and the slow one, the corporate and social consequences, would take its time. Revenge is not instantaneous. It is patient. That night I dreamed of small, ordinary things, tea stirred with a silver spoon, a walk in an autumn park. When I woke, I felt both lighter and strangely hollow. The fallout continued. The company announced a preliminary finding that suggested misuse of corporate resources. His name was withheld in the public release, but internally, the paper trail was enough for suspension. The community event board issued a statement about pending inquiries. He lost a speaking engagement to a rising young colleague. People I used to know in the periphery began to act as if the life I had lived was a story I had read about someone else. The isolation I had felt during the initial shock twisted into a new shape. I was isolated by assumption. People assumed I was broken because anyone betrayed is assumed to be fragile. But being wrong does not require fragility. It requires strategy. As he fell, I noticed how other parts of him frayed. He started drinking in the afternoons, the kind of drinking that numbs but does not erase. I saw flyers of him at the theater with the corners folded and thought of how easily those public tokens lose their currency. He looked smaller in photos from events now, the smile not reaching his eyes. I was, in a clandestine way, glad to see the people around him shuffle. And yet, someone else was suffering in this storm too. The lover I had once toyed with emotionally appeared in public one night, mascara streaked down her cheeks. I watched a video from my feed of her leaving a cafe, face pressed into her hands. For a moment, a tremor of regret shot through me. She was not a villain. She was a person who had fallen into a pattern she didn't fully understand. The consequence of my actions rippled outward, touching unplanned lives. That realization settled in my chest like a stone. I began to weigh the shape of vengeance against the collateral cost. I had aimed my arrows at him, but arrows do not always travel alone. They pierce cloth, flesh, sometimes hearts you never intended to wound. The city around us whispered and watched. I was praised in private messages, commended for my courage. I was scolded politely by friends who wondered if there might have been another path. People remade me into a heroine in some circles and a villain in others. I did not know which I preferred. One afternoon, a package arrived at my door. Inside was a small box, a token of apology, he said, though there was no note explaining why he'd sent it. I left it unopened on the kitchen counter as if it were evidence. For a brief moment I considered sending back his things, returning the private artifacts of a shared life. Instead I put the box in a drawer that I used for things I didn't want to think about. Out of sight, out of mind, I told myself. But hiding things does not erase them. The drawer filled with tiny items, a cufflink, a ticket stub, a line from a joke he used to tell. Each small object became an index of memory, and memory is a stubborn thing. I found myself cataloging these items the way I had cataloged his receipts. Perhaps it was a ritual, an attempt to contain the grief in tidy leather-bound categories. Or perhaps it was a way to measure how much I still held. The final blow came unexpectedly. A colleague who had once admired him sent me a message saying she had been called in for questioning by compliance. She wanted to know if I had anything more to add. She sounded frightened. In that moment I realized the scope of what I had set in motion. The machinery of accountability had a life of its own. It would not stop simply because I desired it to. People would be implicated, reputations would be re-examined, careers shuffled. The consequences I wanted were no longer mine alone. I thought of letting it stop. I pictured a life where the man who had betrayed me was simply gone from my periphery, no headlines, no meetings, no awkward dinners. Where the shadow of his betrayal shrank to a less invasive shape. But the part of me that had seen the quiet arithmetic of his deceit could not accept a life half-fixed. I wanted the calculus completed. I wanted to balance the ledger because if I did not, the ledger would balance itself in ways I could not control. So I chose to keep moving forward. At night, when the city quieted and the noise of the public scandal abated into a static hum, I allowed myself to feel what I had been avoiding. The anger that had lit the first fires had cooled into something else, a fierce, cold clarity. It was not righteous fury anymore. It was survival, with the edges smoothed by determination. I was no longer the woman who had been blindsided. I was the one writing the sentences other people would read and judge. That power felt both intoxicating and terrifying. I began preparing for the next phase. Legal consequences, potential settlements, the threat of counterclaims, these were the next plateaus I had to climb. I hired counsel of my own, not to sue, but to make sure that when the dust settled, I would not be the one left with nothing. I wanted security, not just revenge. Money could not undo the betrayal, but it could buy me choices. And so the stage was set for the confrontation I had long deferred, not a public spectacle, but a legal duel that would force him to account in a court of law or a negotiating room. The machinery I'd set in motion had teeth, and now those teeth would bite both ways. I sat in the quiet of my apartment, the city lights blinking like distant witnesses, and wondered what would remain of me after the final tally. Would I be intact? Would I recognize myself? Or would the act of dismantling him hollow me out into something I no longer wanted to inhabit? I did not have the answer. I only had the next move. And the next move was to make sure he could not simply buy his way out of consequences with rehearsed regrets. I would make sure that the truth was not just a rumor but a record. There was one final piece of the plan I had kept hidden. It was the photograph, the one that had started all this. I had not released it. I had not needed to. But I kept it because I knew the photograph was not just an image, it was the compression of a moment that held an entire world of meaning. If the legal battle demanded black and white proof, I would produce it. If he tried to silence me, the photograph would be my last defense. For now, I placed it in a secure folder and closed the drawer. The photograph watched from darkness like a small comet, waiting for the moment to shine. The next chapter would involve more than reputations and papers. It would involve choices that forced us both to face who we had become. I had begun the work of unmaking his world, now I had to finish it, carefully, deliberately, without becoming the kind of person I had once feared. There would be a hearing. There would be a negotiation. There would be truth pressed into the light. And somewhere in the middle of all that, I would have to decide whether justice was enough, or whether I wanted something darker. The night closed around me, and I felt the city breathe. The trap I had set was no longer idle. It had teeth. It had momentum. Now I waited, for the moment when the weight of his choices would finally break him, and for the moment when I would finally be free to choose what came next. The hearing felt like stepping into an operating theater. Bright lights, soft hum of air conditioning, people in suits moving with professional indifference. My lawyer had me sit beside her at a small table. Across from us, his counsel spread sheets with a calm that pretended certainty. Between us lay the file, the physical thing that had become the hinge of our lives, copies of receipts, printouts of messages, the hotel confirmation, the CCTV stills. The photograph that had started it all remained offline, folded into a secure folder my lawyer alone could access. I had learned to let other people hold the evidence, it made me less vulnerable. We waited as the panel shuffled in, three faces with neutral eyes and the sort of pens that had written policy for years. The process was formal, almost ritualistic, points read aloud, objections lodged politely, a stenographer tapping keys in a rhythm that felt like a metronome for truth. I felt oddly calm. The months of slow work had crystallized into this concentrated moment. The past that had been shredded into receipts and screenshots became a narrative here, ordered and lawful. He sat with his jaw clenched. When he looked at me, his eyes darted away, like someone avoiding mirrors. I didn't want him to look. I wanted him to feel the weight of what he'd done without the relief of my scrutiny. But when the panel asked me to speak, the room narrowed to the size of my breath. I spoke slowly, deliberately. I told them about irregularities, about misused funds, about the pattern that suggested these were not isolated errors but choices. I didn't tell them everything I knew, legal strategy requires discipline, but I said enough to anchor the paper trail to the man who had built a life on appearances. Each word landed like a coin in a jar. The jar grew heavy. His lawyer tried to discredit me the way lawyers do, raise doubts, suggest bias, imply motive. She is angry, the lawyer said in that steely voice built from other people's anger. There is a personal vendetta. It was true. I was angry, and I had motive. I did not deny it. Anger doesn't negate fact, it simply colors the speaker. My lawyer stood when it was her turn and did what she had been hired to do. She mapped out the documentation, showed how dates aligned, how corporate policy had been violated. The truth, held by the right hands, is a stubborn thing. When they called him to present his side, he fumbled with explanations. He offered names and schedules that, upon inspection, didn't match. He tried to claim a client dinner that could not be verified. He had the option of honesty, but he chose obfuscation, as if concealment could fix the present. It did not. The panel's questions were surgical, and his answers were cotton. Between legal points and careful cross-examination, something else happened, the human reckoning. A junior compliance officer, someone who had spent afternoons parsing spreadsheets, looked at me and asked quietly, "How did you catch this?" She did not ask because she doubted me, she asked because she wanted to learn how systems can fail and how people can see them. I told her the truth, small attentions, oddities on calendars, a receipt that did not fit the narrative, and she made notes the way a student takes down a lesson. At the end of the day, the panel did what panels do, they deferred a final decision and recommended deeper investigation. But the momentum had shifted. The temporary suspension was extended. Meanwhile, the company legal team called for a fuller audit. The world he'd depended on was narrowing into rooms where paper and testimony replaced gossip and goodwill. He lashed out privately. The man who had once been casual and charming became animalistic in his fear. He sent messages that alternated between pleading and rage. Once, late at night, he knocked on my door, disheveled, smelling faintly of whiskey, and begged me to stop. I opened the door and watched him breathe like someone who had run through a fire and expected to be saved by water someone else would bring. "You're ruining both of us," he said. It was the old conditional love, "Save me and maybe we can go back." I said nothing. Words felt like currency he did not deserve. He tried to flip the script in other ways. He hired a private investigator to dig into me, to find dirt I had hidden in the folds of ordinary life. It was an ugly, petty thing for a man who had cloaked his life in lies to seek to smear the one person who had pulled the curtain. The investigator called with a smugness that assumed he had ammunition. He produced nothing of consequence, old photos from before we were careful, a teenage mistake, the sort of thing that reads as context in a biography and a scandal in a headline. My lawyer filed a cease and desist. The man's desperation had the odor of a drowning person grabbing at straws. Publicly, the whisper became louder. Friends began to ask difficult questions. Some called to say they were sorry, others seemed to distance themselves in the way bird flocks shift when a predator nears. A co-worker of mine, someone whose life had nothing to do with his choices, texted to say she had heard things and hoped I was okay. The messages that came in were a mixture of empathy and the kind of curiosity that boxes grief into a spectacle. I found myself in counseling for the first time in years, not because the plan demanded it, but because I could feel the architecture of me shifting. The therapist asked me to describe how I felt when the photograph first appeared, when the hotel confirmed its booking, when the audit email arrived. Each memory was a fracture that traceable to a small, sharp pain. Saying it aloud was like setting a seal, the wound acknowledged, the infection named. The lawyer on his side tried a new move, a counterclaim hinting that I had engaged in coercion and harassment, that I had invaded his privacy to fabricate a story. His claim was thin and theatrical, but in the court of public opinion, theatrics can be as loud as truth. My counsel prepared for it. We had built our case on documents and chronology, he had built his on assertion. The mediation day arrived with a gray sky. We sat across a long table in a conference room whose beige paint was designed to calm people into civility. He looked tired in a way that almost made me pity him, and then I remembered that pity is a dangerous currency, it can soften resolve. The mediator opened with neutral language, and the negotiation began. He offered to resign quietly and accept a financial settlement if I would sign a non-disclosure agreement. It was the classic plea, pay me and let me disappear. I listened, and I weighed. Money wasn't my end. Money could buy my independence, yes, but what I wanted was not only to be safe, it was to make sure what happened to me wouldn't be easily repeated. A quiet exit would let him walk away with a wound patched and a life rebuilt elsewhere. That was not justice. You want public accountability, my lawyer said, not as a question but as a map of our posture. She had read him correctly. The company, sensing reputational risk, indicated they preferred an internal settlement, a way to close the file without more headlines. They left us to decide. He was sincere in his desperation. He promised public penance, a statement of apology pre-approved by PR. He offered therapeutic programs, volunteering commitments, even a staggered restitution plan. It was all performative if it was done behind closed doors. I wanted something that cut the architecture of his concealment in a way that would be visible and permanent. So I made a demand that surprised both them and myself. I wanted not only a resignation and restitution but a public admission of wrongdoing, unmediated by PR language. I wanted him to stand in front of the community and say, plainly, what he had done. I wanted him to explain why he had used the resources he did and to answer questions transparently. The demand was blunt and risky. It would humiliate him in a way that some might call cruel. It would also ensure the ledger was public. They balked. The company feared precedent. His counsel feared reputation. The mediator suggested a middle ground, a carefully worded public statement acknowledging mistakes without graphic detail. I countered, specificity matters. If it's vague, I said, people will assume what they prefer. My argument was legal and moral at once, accountability must be legible. After hours of negotiation, the agreement took shape like a sculpture carved slowly. He would resign. He would issue a public statement admitting misuse of corporate funds and apologizing for the breach of trust. The statement would include specific dates and an acknowledgement of the patterns uncovered. He would enroll in counseling and make financial restitution to my household for the tangible expenses and emotional investments disrupted by his choices. The company would enact a review of internal expense policies and publish the findings as a measure of systemic change. In exchange, we would agree to forego litigation that would further entangle us and seek to preserve some privacy for people not involved in the case. It was not perfect. It was, I realized, a negotiated truth, scraped and smoothed into something that felt like justice without being vengeance. When he read the final draft aloud, his voice cracked. He apologized, the words were small and human. I watched him say them and saw that confession is both a shield and a punishment. The world would read it and judge as it would. I would have my record. Walking out of the mediation, I felt lighter and blunted at once. The public admission would not erase the embers of betrayal in me. It would, however, transform the private hurt into a public ledger. The settlement would keep the photograph from being splashed across tabloids. Instead, it would anchor the truth in an official record. I had wanted to expose him fully, to flood every channel with proof, but I had also wanted to survive. Survival requires trade-offs. That night, after he'd signed and the papers had been stamped, I sat alone with the drawer that held the photograph. The image had once been a weapon I'd thought to use only if all else failed. It was also a wound I did not want to weaponize without thought. I had chosen a course that made it unnecessary to make it public. He would be accountable in the way that would matter most to his life, professionally and publicly, but not spectacularly. Still, some part of me wanted the photograph shown, wanted the world's gaze to fracture him beyond repair. I recognized that desire for what it was, a hunger. I had spent months learning to wield systems and people like a craftsman, and now I had to decide whether to keep making art out of pain or to stop. The settlement's terms took hold over the next weeks. He resigned. The company published an audit and announced policy changes. Local press covered it with predictable cycles of scrutiny. He released his statement, done through his counsel but with enough specificity to match the record. People reacted, some with support, some with scorn. My friends returned in varying degrees, some offering quiet solidarity, others offering awkward apologies. Life, it seemed, was reconstituting itself around a new center. But the personal work remained. I had rebuilt my safety net, legal counsel who would stand by me, financial plans to secure my future, a small circle of friends who had remained. The public record soothed some worries. The photograph was not leaked, the story did not become a smear campaign. Yet I felt the weight of something else, the hardness in me. There was an ache I hadn't anticipated. Revenge, even when measured, leaves residue. The woman I had been, soft in ways that had led me to forgive too readily, was not fully back. The work of reclaiming tenderness would be longer than any legal settlement. I understood that consolation comes in small increments, a morning where the coffee tastes like something other than survival, a walk where the sunlight doesn't feel like a judge. The drawer stayed closed. The photograph watched from the dark like a small, angry star. I had the choice to release it into the world and let it burn everything raw, or to keep it private and let the legal record stand for what it was worth. For now, I chose to keep it hidden. I chose not because I feared doing harm to him, I did, but because I feared what I might become if I chose spectacle over healing. There was still one loose edge, his attempt to besmirch me via the investigator. The investigator's files became evidence in our negotiation, and when confronted, his notes turned out flimsy and personal. The attempt to smear me only hardened our case, it revealed motive and desperation. In the end, it became another column in the ledger that documented not just infidelity, but a pattern of evasive behavior. As winter edged into early spring, the city softened, and with it my own sharp angles dulled. I began to sleep better. I took the long way home sometimes, as if distance could be a form of meditation. I met a neighbor for tea who didn't know my past and listened to nothing but small talk. In the quiet, the choice I had made at mediation, public admission, restitution, policy change, felt like the closest thing to justice I could craft without turning myself into a mirror of his cruelty. There remained the final chapter, what I would do with the photograph and with the parts of my story that belonged only to me. Would I publish a memoir? Would I burn every trace and begin anew? Or would I hold the image as a talisman reminding me that certain things could never be unseen, and that survival means living with what you know, not trying to erase it? Those were questions for last. For now, I had won the day. The man who had walked away with a head full of reasons and a heart of excuses had lost the structure that had enabled his choices. The company tightened its policies. The community had its answers. I had my record. And somewhere in the space between satisfaction and hollow, I felt the small tilt towards something resembling peace. The final act, the one I had been saving like a card up my sleeve, remained to be played. Part of me wanted to tuck it away forever. Another part wanted to let it free, to watch the fallout like a storm I'd invited. The choice would be mine. The photograph rested quiet in its drawer. The world had been unmasked, the man had fallen. The last move, I realized, would define not only him but me. The night before it ended, I sat in silence, no music, no phone, no lights except the thin gold glow from the street lamp outside my window. The air was heavy with that strange calm that comes after a long storm, when you can finally hear yourself breathe. The drawer beside me stayed half open. Inside, the photograph waited like a living thing, the single piece of evidence that had started everything. I had kept it locked away for months, afraid of what it could still do. The company had taken its action, he had given his apology, the public had moved on, but I hadn't. The world believed the chapter was closed. Yet every night, that photograph whispered from the dark, "You're not finished." For weeks I told myself that forgiveness was strength, that closure came from walking away. But walking away felt like pretending. He had destroyed something sacred and walked off with an apology written by his lawyer. The world called it accountability. I called it theater. So I made one final decision. Not rage-driven, not reckless, precise. It began with an email. I drafted it at midnight, rewrote it 10 times before hitting send. No threats, no bitterness, no names. Just the truth. It went to the ethics board at his new consulting firm, the one he'd joined quietly a few months after the settlement. He'd used another name on LinkedIn, shortened, like trimming guilt from a syllable could make it disappear. But he couldn't change the facts. The email included documents that weren't part of the public record, expense sheets, timestamped receipts, the audit summary. Nothing illegal to share, nothing defamatory. Just truth. By dawn, I'd gone from trembling to calm. I didn't even check for a reply. Some actions are meant to echo on their own. 2 days later, my phone vibrated. A short message from an unknown number. "We've received your submission. Thank you for your integrity." That was all. No signature. No promise. But I knew. Within a week, whispers began. Not headlines this time, quiet removals, his profile vanishing from company pages, a digital disappearance disguised as a career transition. His attempt at reinvention had evaporated. And I realized something profound: revenge doesn't always need fire. Sometimes it just needs accuracy. I thought I would feel triumphant. Instead, I felt empty. Not in a bad way, more like standing in an empty room after moving out. The echoes were there, but so was space. For the first time in months, I opened the curtains fully and let the sunlight flood the place. The light fell on everything, on the desk where I'd planned, the walls that had held my anger, and the drawer that had kept my secret prisoner. I opened it. Took the photograph in my hands. It was smaller than I remembered. Just an image, paper and pixels. It had lost its power over me, like a snake defanged. I studied it for a long time. Then, without a speech or tears, I took a lighter from the drawer, stepped onto the balcony, and held the flame to the edge of the photograph. The paper curled, blackened, then turned to ash. The smoke rose, twisting into the sky like a final sigh. When it was gone, so was something else, the weight. The following months passed quietly. I didn't chase stories about him, didn't ask mutual friends for updates. I built new routines: morning runs, coffee at a cafe where no one knew my history, volunteering at a shelter on weekends. People saw me smile again and assumed I'd healed. Maybe I had, but not in the way they thought. Healing isn't forgetting. It's remembering without flinching. I still had nights when I woke up and expected to hear his voice in the next room. Still had moments where I caught a scent that brought everything back. But those memories no longer ruled me, they were just pages in a book I'd already finished reading. Sometimes, in therapy, I talked about the fire, literal and metaphorical. My therapist once asked, "Do you regret the last step?" I thought about it. About the email, the exposure, the way his life had unraveled piece by piece. About the photograph's final burn. "No," I said. "But I regret letting him define so much of my story before I wrote the ending." She smiled. "And now?" "Now," I said, "I write my own." Spring turned to summer. I found myself drawn to places I hadn't been in years: bookstores, beaches, noisy cafes. The world was loud again, and I liked it that way. People talked, laughed, lived, and for once, I wasn't listening for subtext or lies. One afternoon, I bumped into someone from the old office. They hesitated, then said, "You look free." I did. Freedom doesn't come from revenge. It comes from knowing that the person who hurt you no longer occupies space in your head. That their downfall isn't your oxygen. A year later, an envelope arrived, no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper. "I know what you did. I don't blame you. I would have done the same. I hope you find peace." "I'm trying to." No signature, but I didn't need one. I folded it carefully, slid it into a box of letters I kept for closure. That was his last word. No contact, no follow-up. Just a quiet acknowledgement between two ghosts of who we used to be. I still think about that first message, the one that shattered everything. The unknown sender who had exposed him, the stranger who decided I deserved to know. I never found out who it was. Maybe it was one of his other lovers. Maybe someone who saw me at a party, smiling next to him, and couldn't stand the lie. Whoever it was, they changed the course of my life with a single act of honesty. Sometimes I wish I could thank them. Other times, I wish they'd never sent it. Because knowing the truth saved me, but it also broke me. And yet, if I had the chance to go back, I'd still want to know. Because ignorance might feel like peace, but it's only the silence before the explosion. Now, when people talk about betrayal, they always imagine screaming, throwing things, dramatic exits. But real betrayal is quiet. It seeps. It reshapes you from the inside. It teaches you to read between smiles, to trust patterns over promises. But it also gives you something unexpected: clarity. I learned that I'm stronger than the worst version of someone else's choices. I learned that revenge doesn't have to be cruel, it can be precise, poetic, and finite. I learned that the most powerful thing a betrayed person can do is live well without apology. A year and a half later, on a rainy evening, I found myself walking past that same hotel, the one where I had first seen them. The neon sign flickered faintly, the building looked smaller, almost shabby. I stopped for a moment, standing under the awning, listening to the rain hit the pavement. I didn't feel anger. Just distance. Once upon a time, that place had been the center of my pain. Now it was just a building. I whispered to no one in particular, "You don't own me anymore." Then I walked away. If hell is a person who knows your weakness, then heaven must be the day you stop letting them use it. And that, finally, was my revenge.